The process for preparing a volumetric solution contains many steps, and all of them have to be executed very carefully because even small errors are going to lower your precision. To make a solution from a solid, you need to weigh the chemical into a small beaker and then dissolve the chemical with solvent. Generally, this will be distilled water. And you can use a stirring rod to help speed along the dissolution if needed. To make a volumetric solution, you're going to need a volumetric flask, and you should also check to make sure that you have a cap for that flask and that the cap actually fits. There's nothing more frustrating than getting to the end of the process and finding out that your cap doesn't fit the flask and needing to start over. The next thing you should do is set up a funnel rack with a glass funnel above your volumetric flask. You're then going to pour your solution from the beaker into the flask using the funnel, and you can use the glass rod to direct the solution. It's important to note that once you've started using the glass rod, that glass rod needs to stay either above the funnel or inside the beaker at all times, because if you lose even a single drop of solution, you really should start over. There's always going to be some leftover material in the beaker, so you'll need to rinse it with some solvent and then transfer that to the flask using the glass stir rod in the funnel, exactly like you just did. In general, you're going to do this rinse and transfer process at least 3 times, using small portions of solvent each time. Depending on how thoroughly you do your rinses, you may need to do more than 3 transfers. Once you've done your transfers from the beaker, you need to make sure you get every last drop of the material off of the funnel and off of the sides of the neck of the volumetric flask. So you need to rinse your glass rod into the funnel if you haven't already done so. You need to rinse the inside of the funnel. You need to rinse the outside and neck of the funnel into the volumetric flask, and then you can remove the funnel. At that point, you then rinse the inside of the neck of the flask. And you do this to make sure you get every single drop of chemical into the bottom of that volumetric flask. Once you've finished your rinsing steps, you need to add water until the flask is approximately 3/4 full. Once you've done this, you should swirl the flask several times to do a premixing step. And the reason that you do this premixing is because when you add a material to a solvent to create a solution, the solution's volume will change and it will be different from the solvent volume. And you want the bulk of this volume change to happen before you get near to the volumetric mark on the neck of the flask. Once you've done the premixing step, you need to add water up until the mark on the neck of the flask. This mark is the volume indicator for your volumetric flask. You need to be very careful not to add water over that mark, or you'll need to start the whole process over again. So you add the water very slowly, and eventually you get to the point where you try to add 1 drop at a time until the meniscus of your solution is just touching the mark. Once you've made your solution up to the mark, you need to cap the flask and then invert the flask 10 to 15 times in order to finalize your mixing process. When you invert, you need to wait for the air bubble to rise to the top of the flask, give it a little shake, and then invert again. And again, wait for the air bubble to rise all the way to the top. then continue the inversion process. The reason you wait for the bubble to move is because the movement of the air bubble actually does most of your mixing for you. The little shake that you give the flask is just to help the mixing process along a little bit more quickly. You should do this inverting process between 10 and 15 times. And once you're done, you've finished making your volumetric solution.